Here, make
frenar.
knock it off at your
Pittsburgh
change result.
is no
Restart.
result.
What is up, my peeps? Welcome back to Medio Raro. Creo que oficialmente ya les puedo dar la bienvenida a la segunda temporada de Medio Raro. Realmente les quiero volver a dar las gracias por estar escuchando, por apoyar este proyecto. When I first started conceptualizing Medio Raro, I always visualized it as like a multimedia type of project. So, para la segunda temporada del programa, todo lo que yo haga ahora en nombre de como Medio Raro, pues es parte de la segunda temporada y así va a seguir como funcionando. So que si me siguen en las redes sociales, creo que es un buen momento para, darle el plug. Me pueden conseguir en Medio Raro Pod en la mayoría de las redes, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, whatever. A través de las redes ya he estado compartiendo ciertos videos, ciertos recaps de eventos. Recientemente ocurrió el Lana Del Rey Tribute. Realmente shout out a Namacho y a todas las personas que se hallaron al momento de hacer este evento. Creo que quedó muy bien. Sí me dio un poco de como National Honor Society Talent Show, pero creo que eso es parte de como el endearing aspect of this type of activity. I really do enjoy and appreciate any como sort of event or performance that like seeks to express some type of devotion to these pop women, o sea, to these women in the music industry. So, cualquier oportunidad que haya para pues, apoyar ese tipo de eventos, pues Medio Raro estará aquí. Adicionalmente, les invito en particular a seguirme en YouTube. Por ahí viene un Medio Raro YouTube era, así que pues les invito a que me sigan en las redes para que pues puedan mantenerse actualizados de todo lo que Medio Raro esté haciendo. But truly, it is a pleasure for me to be able to introduce this new season of Medio Raro with this interview I recently did with somebody that has become a great friend of the show, Yara Farad. Nosotros nos conocimos a través de LinkedIn, o sea, una de las pocas historias de éxito con esta plataforma. Y en ese momento dado, tuvimos una conversación sobre Bad Bunny y cómo las personas de Líbano, el país natal de nuestra amiga Yara, y personas de Puerto Rico, pues analizaban e interpretaban y decoded, mucho ojo con ese término, los mensajes culturales, políticos, sociales que se veían y se ven en la música de Bad Bunny, particularmente en el álbum Un Verano Sin Ti. Es graduada del London School of Economics and Political Science con una maestría en estudios de comunicación y medios. Para este episodio pensamos entonces pues continuar esa conversación que habíamos comenzado acerca de cómo pues las personas interpretan y más que nada internalizan la música de Bad Bunny. Yo sé que en Puerto Rico it's kind of like, God damn it, yet another conversation about Bad Bunny. But I feel like this conversation really sought out to focus more on like particular aspects of that conversation while also giving the opportunity for a more type of like intimate, personal approach to the idea of how music can contain political messaging and how that in turn influences the people that listen to this music. So not only do we talk about Bad Bunny, we also talk about Madonna, Lady Gaga. Of course, I always have to talk about Madonna. We also mention Taylor Swift. So really, it just ends up being like a very good conversation on how we are observing and noticing these new ways people are interacting with music and the way audiences interact with the artists that they follow. So thanks again to Jara for being available to have this conversation and for being a wonderful person to have a conversation with. And I hope you enjoy. Mi nombre es Rubén Antonio y esto es Medio Raro, donde tenemos conversaciones esotéricas sobre la música y cultura popular. Thanks again, Jara, really for the time in this space. I'm really excited for the discussion that we are going to have. I'm also really grateful that you chose me to participate in this study. I think something que pasa mucho aquí en Puerto Rico que oftentimes people see another study of Bad Bunny. It's like, oh, okay, yet another study of Bad Bunny's cultural relevance. But I really did enjoy the fact that you chose to do like a comparative study on how Puerto Ricans decode and interpret Bad Bunny's music and how Lebanese people decode it. So that's why first thing first, but I wanted to know a little bit about the background of your study and why you chose Bad Bunny as your figure of study.
Thank you so much for having me. Muchas gracias por tu participación también en mi tesis, que fue informaciones muy importantes. Quería decir, sí, pues mi nombre es Yara, soy de Líbano, Costa de Marfil y Canadá, y me interesa mucho y profundamente la intersección de la cultura y de los medios. Quería decir que voy a intentar en algunas veces de hablar en español, porque es eso que como es importante para mí también que relates a mi estudio, pero discúlpenme por las errores de gramática y todo eso. Acabo de graduarme de mi maestría en medios y comunicaciones y mi estudio habla de el decoding de la música de Bad Bunny, pero en two angles essentially. So from the Puerto Rican lens and then from the Lebanese lens. So I'm from Lebanon originally, and I'm a huge Bad Bunny fan, so I think I need to get that out of the way. And so what led me to study this, I mean, obviously I had a lot of classes during my time at LSE and studying media, and my favorite one was essentially about audiences, and it was a study on telenovelas, essentially, and how different audiences decoded telenovelas differently. So maybe a telenovela that came from Mexico, so different people in Mexico would maybe not understand the message, but then some people in another place in Brazil would connect entirely with the telenovela. So that's something that really sparked my interest in multicultural understanding and multicultural decoding, and why we resonate with some medium and some music and some kind of like cultural shows more than others from the cultural lens. And in parallel, I was also rediscovering, I think, Un Verano Sin Ti. So that year, it just became, I just was listening to it all the time. And I started to pay way more attention to the lyrics and asking myself why it was so important to me and why I was connecting to it so much. And here I really need to give a big shout out to Mariana, which is one of my closest friends that I made this year at LSE, and she's from Puerto Rico. And a lot of the times we were having really interesting conversations about the political contexts of Puerto Rico and of Lebanon. And we're seeing so many overlaps between both.
Do you remember like your first encounter with Bad Bunny and his music, or like how did you like become a fan of his?
Yes, so actually I think it started more with reggaeton itself. So I kind of started by riding that wave of transnational consumption of reggaeton, you know, when I don't even know if we can call it reggaeton, but like, you know, when Despacito started to become like a big thing, and then started, you know, like I Like It and all these kind of like bigger songs that were on that international level. And it's something that I just always found so like I don't know if it's in terms of culture, but it's a music genre that I just resonated with so much. But it was very much on that culture, like on that superficial kind of like upper level still. And then I started getting more and more into reggaeton because I had you know, some friends that were from Peru, and then I was living with them in the house, and it was just like playing 24/7 there, and I just loved it so much. And I loved just the dancing that came with it. I loved the body expression that came with dancing on reggaeton, and it's just something that I connected with quite a lot. But at the time it was still, again, very como que this transnational homogenization of culture. Like for me, it was just listening to like this como que Latinx like music genre. Like it was kind of like everything. I couldn't distinguish between, you know, like music that originated from Argentina or from Puerto Rico, or I wasn't specifically looking at Bad Bunny. Actually, I started my love with Osuna, to be fair. And then I think
but Bad Bunny is a much better example.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna say,
So then exactly, I think I really started to connect with it deeply. I mean, I started to have those questionings myself, particularly when I was studying media and communications and kind of trying to understand our consumption and our responsibility as kind of like consumers of those multicultural in between brackets genres and kind of like becoming more active and more responsible when listening to this. So for me, it was kind of like at first I was like singing things that I didn't understand what I was singing. And it was just interesting to me as to like why that was happening. And then at the same time, it kind of awakened this like, no, like I need to have more of an active consumption of things. And I think particularly with Bad Bunny, it really came with Un Verano Sin Ti. Like I think it's really that album that drew me specifically to become a Bad Bunny fan amongst others, just because I felt like I think my first encounter with the album was just listening to the sounds. It was just such a journey, like going from Moscow Mule to Después de la Playa to Titi me preguntó to El Apagón, like just the different sounds that it was taking you on. Like for me, it was I just instantly felt like what an album.
I really do think
Um,
that Un Verano Sin Ti is like the result of Bad Bunny's career up until that point, in terms of him recognizing himself as like a figure that was like suddenly being put on, I wouldn't say like a pedestal, but like I do believe that he recognized that he did have a voice and that he did serve as a certain representation for the, oh my God, this generation of Puerto Ricans. We're like really proud of him in that sense. Tengo que decir que me quedé sin taquilla recently for the concert que va a ser ahora en junio. But I wanted to ask, como, do you hear a lot of Bad Bunny's music abroad? I know that you study in London. You also live in Lebanon. Como, how's the reception of his music over there?
I mean, I do feel like it's so interesting to me because like Bad Bunny really is one of the biggest artists now on an in between brackets like international level. So even in those areas and those spaces where people don't necessarily understand Spanish or don't listen to reggaeton, but I think because it has so many big hits, and I think social media also kind of propelled that in that more international scene. So I know that I hear quite a lot Titi me preguntó, Después de la Playa, Daikiti, and then his very earlier songs as well. So they kind of became hits, and then just lots of people listen to them, and they just play in clubs as like one of those big hit songs, like the same way that you would hear other kind of like really history marking hits, and then everyone's just dancing to it. So in that sense, it's quite present in Lebanon in the same way. And then you have parties that are more specifically, so like more reggaeton slash Latino, like they kind of have that broader identity, and then they're just played all sorts of music, and then you would have way more specific like Bad Bunny songs. And then here there's this really big party that kind of like traveled, I think, around the world. It's called Bresh. Yeah, I think it started in Argentina, if I'm not mistaken. So that has been the only place where I've been partying in London. And then there is, because you can really, it's more authentic in that sense, and you have way more of the less commercial, like kind of like less popular on that international scene songs.
Like,
But there definitely isn't an understanding of his message. I think even this is something that I've realized, that even in other, even with people that speak Spanish and that listen to his songs way more, I would say, than non-Spanish speaking people, I think his message is still, there's still a big disparity in the understanding of the cultural impact that Bad Bunny has. Like, I think it's very much, and that I think I understood it also, like kind of moving forward myself from that consumption that is a bit more commercialized to the deeper research and understanding of actually what his music is and what it means. And there's a big gap, I think, between both.
so your study is titled Everything About Bad Bunny's Music is So Puerto Rican, an audience study on the decodings of Bad Bunny's music by Puerto Rican and Lebanese listeners. I wanted to know, like, why was it important for you to make this comparison, and what, like, the type of approach you implemented on it once you decided on this topic for your study?
So basically, and to also go back on the personal level as to what made me connect so much more with Un Verano Sin Ti was El Apagón. Like for me, I think that was the song that just kind of shifted everything, because from the moment that I started understanding its deeper layers, I mean, the blackout, the electricity blackout. I mean, this is something that we've lived so much in Lebanon in the last 3 years. Just to give you a bit of a context, so in Lebanon, in October 2019, we had really, really big protests where at the beginning around 2 million Lebanese people came down to the streets, and we were just fed up with the whole corruption and the way that the country was being run, and were just asking for the resignation of the government. And from there on, there was kind of like a ripple effect that so many other things happened. I mean, there was the beginning of the economic crisis that had started way before and then just escalated from here on. And then COVID. And all of this essentially led to a huge electricity crisis and fuel shortage in the country. So during those years, I mean, blackouts were extremely common. Our whole lives were kind of like run, I mean, still very much are, I think, but less than before by kind of like the timings in which we have electricity and then just kind of moving around all of this. And I think that that was such a big element of, you know, like life in Lebanon, and also the pain that came with that and the struggle that came with that. And then also it representing just the whole corruption of the government. So I think that is the first element that kind of like, I listened to the song and I was like, I relate to this, like song word by word. And then I just started to research more deeper about it. And I think it was at the time as well that Bad Bunny had started to date Kendall Jenner. So those rumors had come out. And for me, it was just so interesting because I was trying to understand, like, you know, again, on surface level, it seems like, oh, like people are pissed because this star is dating Kendall Jenner. And I was reading a lot of kind of like, you know, like those big headlines that were more Western media. And it was just, there was just no understanding as to like, for me, it was so obvious. It was like, yeah, but there's a deeper reason why people are pissed, and there must be a deeper reason why people are pissed because
I
there's
think
such a cultural representation in this.
the fact is it's like what it represents for him to be dating Kendall Jenner, especially, you know, considering that Puerto Rico has a long history of colonialism. And I
Yes.
think that has generated, first of all, it really does explain the why we're so como attached to Bad Bunny as a celebrity, as an artist, because he kind of does represent that idea of somebody that is like unapologetically Puerto Rican.
Yes.
So him dating this white rich woman from Calabasas, I say this as like a fan of the Kardashians, if you can even call me that. But that was kind of, it did make people feel like it was sort of like a betrayal, which I have my differences with that como a conclusion, but there's no denying that the idea of him dating this person did represent something Puerto Rico, given our context and all that. Okay, I wanted to see if you can como elaborate a little bit more on like Lebanon's political context and what led to those protests in October.
It was kind of a ripple effect of things. So, I mean, the country for the longest time, it's so much to put into one, but essentially, I think the starting point would definitely be the civil war that went on from 1975 to 1990s. And then the coming out of that, the kind of like post-war Lebanon had set like a really, I mean, I think since then we've just been recovering essentially from everything that happened, and the way that that coming out of the war happened, I think has just led us to wherever we are now. So in all those years of kind of like rebuilding and reconstructing and obviously lots of political upheaval in the region as well, basically led us to having like a government completely corrupt, more focused on, let's say, gains and growing personal agendas rather than obviously building the country. And then in parallel, so Lebanon is a country where the government is divided by religion because of our, again, like it was the post-civil war, because the big headlines of the civil war, I mean, it's kind of really simplifying it, saying it like this, but there was always like fights between the different religions that we have in the country. And so the post-civil war, there's this accord called Taif that tried to kind of like make things a bit more equal in the government by trying to have like kind of like an equal division of positions between Christians and Muslims, which are again big labels with other sub kind of like religions that come under it. And that obviously with the mismanagement that came just created a lot of divisions in the country, in the politics, in the way that the country is run. But then also just overall in that broader Lebanese identity that we have. So, you know, like there's such a strong identity in Lebanon where it's like you're Lebanese, but then you're also kind of like your religion or like the region that you're originally from. And that comes with so many things in the background. A big part of the revolution and a lot of protests and a lot of big upheavals had happened before, like in 2015. And then during the Arab Spring, kind of like, so it wasn't the first big demonstration that we had, but this is the first time I think that people had this slogan that essentially was like Kelon yani Kelon, which like all of them means all of them, and it was kind of like saying, you know, like everyone before, used to kind of like follow these big political figureheads. They're like 6 or 7 or so, that are all kind of like from a certain religion and a certain political party, and they represent different things. And everyone just kind of came to the streets and was like, it's time to be putting fingers and the blame on like everyone, because all of them somewhere went wrong essentially, and we want to build the country from scratch, and we want to build the country from like a stronger foundation with the Lebanese identity before anything else. And it was a really like a lot of big part of that revolution with students and young people and people with that vision that we just want that Lebanese identity, and we want to move past that corruption, and we just want to build a country that essentially is sustainable, is viable, where we can stay. We don't have to keep moving abroad and coming back and always being scared of our safety and so on. So that is kind of a bit ideas behind the October 17th revolution.
Greatly explained, honestly. It does come all ring very familiar in terms of like Puerto Rico's own situation. Because I remember when we first started talking, I first started researching a little bit more about Lebanon's political history. 2019 was like a year where we both had significant protests. In our case, but it was like July, el concepto de Ricky renuncia. Reminding ourselves that Bad Bunny was like a figurehead among this, like convocando a las personas para ir. He wasn't the only reason why people were going, but definitely having his support as somebody that of like a big level of fame, it was very significant. I remember seeing him in the big protest that happened where I think was like, I don't know if it was like 1 million people, but like a lot of people were en este expreso Las Américas aquí en San Juan, que es como el expreso principal de la ciudad. I remember seeing him, I remember seeing Residente, Ricky Martin, que sé que otra persona que menciona. So que fue este momento where it did feel very unifying, y for similar reasons also as in Lebanon, political corruption. We were just coming off the heels of Hurricane Maria, which is a devastating hurricane that we're still recovering from. And I find interesting, como you mentioned, reconstructing, the idea of like reconstructing after like a disaster, metaphorically speaking, because here in Puerto Rico, I think our government has really como attached itself to the idea that the work that they're doing is not constructing, it's like reconstructing. So it becomes like a thing about language and how a lot of people in power benefited from this type of crisis and still do. En las protestas de julio del 2019, pues fue este momento that pues obviamente la historia colonial de Puerto Rico, lo que sucedió con Huracán María, corruption is like the word of the day in our government. So it kind of all came to head, and it did fulfill its purpose. O sea, Ricardo Rosselló, our governor at the time, did resign. However, pues that brought along other issues. So I wanted to ask, como, what was the response of the Lebanese government towards the protests that were going on?
So it's so funny because for us it's the same. The Prime Minister Saad Hariri did like he did renunciar también. And the idea was that, for us in our politics, when the Prime Minister renuncia, que no puedo pensar en la palabra en inglés ahora, que the whole government falls apart essentially. But the thing is, like, it's like we're stuck in a loop because the people who appointed the new ministers were still people in the government, and then our elections wouldn't happen until, I think, was it 2022 that we voted? Yes, 2022. We voted for the parliamentaries. So during those elections, we did see the result of kind of like that mobilization, because there was kind of like this list of new change prime ministers, and then there was a really strong mobilization for us to kind of like be voting for those. And I mean, you saw those changes in the society more than in the government and in the politics. So for me, if I look back on October 17th, I think the biggest wins in between brackets, because a lot of people have opinions on this. A lot of people say, the revolution failed and we still have the same government. And, obviously, like, the years that came after the revolution were catastrophic in terms of, the politics, in terms of the economy, in terms of, because we also had the August 4th explosion, which is something I'll bring back as well after. But people tend to look at it like, okay, like, the revolution didn't change anything. But I think that these things don't happen in like the span of a month. And I think that, at least in terms of my generation and a lot of also the older generations, like, it really represented a shift in one, the identity that we want to have in the country in terms of that like broader Lebanese identity as opposed to kind of more sectarian identity. And then it just really planted that seed of, fighting for a culture as well. So I've seen so many people from my generation kind of like being reattached to Arabic, whilst, we grew up being like, learn other languages and English is more practical and French and whatever. I mean, my own Arabic is so broken, but then we all kind of started making a conscious and collective effort to be like, no, like we're going to read and write in Arabic and kind of like being reattached to trying to create and define like a Lebanese identity, and at the same time being very much aware of pointing fingers. Essentially, I think that's the biggest one that came out of it. So people just started to look and being like, look, like these funds are being mismanaged. Where is this going? Like what happened with I don't know, like that project that wasn't supposed to happen. And so lots of small ones happened. I think that we're gonna see the results of it way later in time. But I would say that it was quite a lot of a change in society.
I agree with that sentiment because en Puerto Rico fue algo similar. Honestly, como it was one of the most interesting times to be a Puerto Rican, that el verano del 2019, como le cuentan o le dicen, because after that we had in the line of succession, pues the person that needed to succeed the recently resigned governor was the Secretary of State, but he resigned as well before that. So we ended up with a female governor for our second time. That was Wanda Vázquez. She was the Justice Secretary. And I think I was going to say her reign, her administration was very interesting in terms of it being inoffensive, particularly because, pues, también ocurrió la pandemia shortly afterwards. So it was a time where, yes, perhaps the political establishment maintained its power, but definitely society did have like a more keen eye in like identifying mismanagement, identifying como corruption dynamics, and also como having the wording to be able to address said corruption. Because in Puerto Rico, como there's a long history of protests. Very big independence movements are still here in Puerto Rico. So que siempre ha habido como ese espíritu de lucha por necesidad. Because we are and we will continue to be indefinitely a colony of the United States. So I do think que, regresando un poco a Bad Bunny, pues la idea de que él fuera esta persona puertorriqueña que estaba cantando en español, que está como asumiendo esta estética y estas ideas que son tan claramente puertorriqueñas y que consiga éxito en Estados Unidos, pues sí, como in a way, I wouldn't call it reparations, but it did develop that feeling of like, oh, okay, como no estamos dejando ver, no estamos dejando como las personas están conociendo lo que es Puerto Rico, y particularly como in this como postmodern, post-social media age where como information is so easily accessible and aesthetics and identities become this como very clearly defined, or well, people still have como their differences on how they define them, but people are more quick to categorize when something is like representative of Puerto Rico en este contexto. Te quería preguntar también, como sé que me han mencionado algunos artistas from Lebanon, como how was like you could say como musical reaction to the political unrest in your country?
I think a lot of artists did gather as well. So we also had a lot of big figures that were kind of like on the scene, and then kind of newer artists. Like I'm thinking a lot about, like, for example, like Adonis, that just kind of has those same sentiments of describing in the music and in the songs. There's also Mashroua Laila, that is like a really, really big group in Lebanon that has had in the country, they've been attacked quite a lot, quite sadly, to the point of kind of there was so much pressure on them because they essentially were releasing songs that were considered quite, strong, essentially, with the message. And then it resonates a lot with newer generations, but then it kind of like had a lot of problems in the country. So we do have a lot of artists in that sense, but I don't think we have a figure that is like Bad Bunny. And I think that for me, this is why, or maybe I'm not aware of it. That's again something that I need to put out there. I resonated a lot with Bad Bunny's music because for me, it felt like someone was kind of like singing those sentiments that I'm feeling and singing that kind of like day-to-day lived experience of what it is to have been in Lebanon from in that bracket of time between like 2020, essentially 2019 to up until today, I would say. And he just captured all those sentiments so perfectly. So, for example, in Una Vez Sin Ti came me encanta 2016 porque habla de esa periodo de tiempo que es como la nostalgia, ¿no? De que antes que todas esas cosas estaba pasando, que tenía también en Líbano esos años de como, for me, I consider them like those golden years in Lebanon y essentially that feeling of like home and being like, oh, like I would give anything para volver a 2016 y a esos días. También, I mean, el apagón is just so representative, like that idea, like even that sentence for me, that like Puerto Rico está bien cabrón, que lo puedo aplicar 100% al Líbano, que Beirut está bien cabrón, que me encanta, está increíble, que es la mejor ciudad del mundo, pero también la odio. Que es, it's like it translates so perfectly in every way. So there was one singer that I did discover during those years. I mean, discover, I'm quite ashamed that I discovered him now because he's quite big in Lebanon, but he's called Ziad al-Rahbani, and I love him so much. So essentially, we have this really big singer in Lebanon called Fairuz, and Ziad is one of her sons. And so Fairuz has always been seen as like this icon and this symbol in the Middle East of kind of like singing that national identity, like that kind of like love for the country and that love for the como la patria. But what I love about Ziad's songs is that it's way more, I feel like, so a lot of Fairuz's songs are way more romanticized. Like it's kind of like really that pretty beautiful, even though she did sing a lot of more political songs, but it's still very much so that kind of like romanticized, unifying image of the country, whereas Ziad kind of says things as they are. And I mean, so essentially, he used to have plays that would happen during the Civil War. So he was very much like an engaged artist. And then he would just sing about the ridicule of it all. So his songs are very like sarcastic. They're very, you know, lots of messages kind of like underneath, but then also very popular. So he would just be singing, they would be playing on the radio. So up until today, it's very, very hard to find like a video recording of his plays. And so people would just be listening to it during the Civil War. And for me, I love that's why I think I also love popular music. Like I just love things that have that simple message that can be understood by so many people. I mean, obviously it's also layered. So Ziad, for example, has a song that it's called Bihel Yomen. So it's like in these 2 days. And he's literally just talking throughout the songs with obviously like background singers and everything. And he's saying, you know, like the electricity is gonna cut off. And then people are like, yeah, I'll come back in these 2 days. Or like, you know, like we are not gonna be able to have water. Like there's a water shortage in the country. They're like, yeah, it's fine. We'll just go fill water from like the well in the village. And then it's like, and if this doesn't get resolved now, like it'll be fine by the year 2000s. And I love that song. I mean, I don't love it. It makes me sad, but it's just the fact that I, in 2024, can still relate to a song that was essentially written during the Civil War. And it's still exactly the same thing. Like when the crisis happened in the last 2 years, it was the same water shortage and then milk shortage and shortage of medicine. And all that song was just like also representative, I think, of a lot of that behavior that we have that, you know, like, you know, Lebanese people are very, very resilient in a lot of ways. And it's something that I admire a lot. And I think having been there in those past years, I understand the need of it because you can't like it's either you fall apart or you just find the silver lining or you just keep going. But then at the same time, that also created that double-edged sword of kind of like adapting too much to all those circumstances that we shouldn't be adapting to.
Pasa mucho en Puerto Rico, como a phenomenon that happens a lot to me is whenever como I'm reading perhaps like newspaper articles from 50 years ago or like academic texts from those from times past, it's like, oh my God, we're still kind of debating and discussing the same issues. También en Puerto Rico pues se ve ese too much como adapting to issues that shouldn't be happening, like como power outages, not having running water. Algo que está pasando mucho en Puerto Rico ahora mismo es que solar panels are being como promoted as the solution to this situation, which I'm all for solar energy. I love solar power by Lord, but I think the issue here, I think the issue here is the idea that again, it's like responsabilizando al ciudadano when this is really como a public government
Sí.
issue.
No, en Lebanon también tenemos esas cosas con los solar panels y es como que estamos en un punto que, ok, quiero hacerlo todo para que jamás, like I'll need to have la ayuda del gobernamiento, pero this is not how a country is supposed to work, you know, like Lebanon is literally run by people and by the private sector essentially. And then obviously people in the government are always trying to find ways to benefit from that. So I was talking to someone, and then so one of the people also that I interviewed, and then we're just having a catch up, and I was telling her like, you know, I'm thinking about it, and I was like, oh God, like I'm so glad that you can't tax the sun because I'm sure politicians
They
are
will
going to
find
find
a
a
way.
way, especially in
They
the
will.
energy sector. And then this girl told me also, like, she was like, I mean, in Puerto Rico, they're having discussions about, like how to tax like this whole solar panel, because they're like, I mean, people are moving to that, and we need to find a way also to essentially, like, I mean, in Lebanon, it's like this, it's like people find solutions, and then the government just tries to capitalize from it, and then it's such a huge mess. Like, it's a huge mess, and I agree with you that it's not people's responsibility to be taking care of these things, but that's what happens because eventually people need to survive, and people need to find solutions to keep going in the day to day. And so I think that's something that's talked about quite a lot in some of those, like, more resistant songs. And I think that also brings me back to a function of music that I really love, and it's something that came in my thesis, that it's kind of that documentation of a society's political views, a society's troubles, like everything that's happening in their day to day. That's why I love listening to Ziad, for example, because for me it's like it's a way to kind of like reflect on the history of Lebanon, and kind of like understand also, like the generation of my mom, my aunts, all of them, they lived through that time, and just kind of like have a glimpse of like their day-to-day reality and see how I connect and overlap with that as well. And I feel like that's what happened to me while listening to Bad Bunny, like it's the lived experience that he's talking about in his songs, about what it is to be living in Puerto Rico when all of this is happening, and that kind of like anger, but then that also love that translates in his music, even if he's not saying the words through the sounds or so. Like, I feel like that's something that is the bigger trigger of why I wanted to do that comparison between Lebanese and Puerto Rican listeners. Because for me, it's like I relate so much to a lot of the things that he says, but also the emotions that he's talking about. And it's just that disparity of things, right? Like, things are so messed up, but then it's also those small things in between the cracks when all of this is happening. Like, he's like, okay, maldita sea otro apagón, vamos a Lubriche a prender un blunt. Like, it's kind of like, okay, what happens in between those moments where all this mess is happening? Because
I
it's like in
wanna
the headlines.
Now that you mentioned that, no me acuerdo la lírica específicamente, pero él dice como, maldita sea otro pagón, vamos para los bleachers a prender un blunt antes que a Pipo le dé un bofetón. So Pipo is like our governor, Pedro Pierluisi. So it's one of those kind of nods to the colloquial way we talk about our government here in Puerto Rico. I think again goes to show the relevance of his music, and how maybe in this case it's very como adamantly political, but it's also those como little nuances that make people grow attached to him, como, or make people have that connection that goes beyond perhaps como solely the musical aspect of it. So I really do still think El Apagón is like his magnum opus. I was thinking that perhaps we could take a break now to como check que todo esté bien y que se escuche bien.
Sí.
Okay, so we're back, people.
Hey.
Ya hemos mencionado varias veces la idea de como transnational music, transnational audiences. So I wanted to see if you could como define a little bit what transnationalism is and how it relates to your study.
Transnational consumption is essentially kind of like looking at the consumption of medium, any kind of medium, from the lens of, I mean, I want to say the world, but that was a bit of a critical issue when I was doing my research, trying to define what is transnational is, because a big part of it is an othering, because it's kind of like positioning the consumption of media and art and kind of like more cultural medium, but from the lens of that Western cultural hegemony, if that makes sense. So it's kind of like whenever we say like, oh, like Bad Bunny is like number one, for example, like with transnational audiences, it's kind of essentially saying, okay, like he was able to break into that like kind of like more global scene. So when it's celebrated, for example, that like he's headlining as the first Latino artist in Coachella, it's kind of like from that lens of like a bit more of that like Western gaze of the consumption of culture, essentially. So that was one of the critical points that I had. It was like, how do you define like what transnational, because you have transnational audiences, which essentially would be kind of like looking at, like people around the world consuming music, not people in one specific country or in one specific part of the world, but it's kind of that globalized consumption of music, media, TV shows, etc. And then when you talk about transnational music, it's kind of like that. It's kind of like that category, like world music, you know? So it's kind of like you have pop and you have rock and then you have world music, which is kind of like como que todo que es exótico. And that is kind of like seeing it from that gaze of like, so there's Western English language kind of like culture that we have all grown up consuming in a bit of a dystopian way, you know, kind of like, I don't know if it's the same with you in Puerto Rico, but like growing up in
Yeah.
Lebanon, very, you know, like Arab country, and then like listening to, I don't know, like watching Twilight. I mean,
Oh,
it's
we were just
it's
watching Twilight here.
I love it. Very, I don't realize how toxic it is, but I mean, big place in my heart. But it's kind of like, you know, we were discussing this before, you know, like kind of like One Direction and just seeing from far, like all that Western in between brackets based art. So then those artists kind of like get positioned as something different from that. So like, you know, like Bad Bunny, and even now like artists like, you know, like Eliana, for example, which is like a big Palestinian Chilean artist. It's kind of like they're breaking into the transnational kind of like music consumption. And actually Bad Bunny has a quote on this. I had written it because it's something that I thought about quite a lot when writing my dissertation. Wait, I'm just trying to find it. So yeah, so he's like, you know, sometimes people forget, or like who knows, maybe gringos weren't paying as much attention. But now that the focus is on us, I wanted to make it clear that there's been a long road before me. And I think that kind of summarizes the angle that I wanted to take in my dissertation, in the sense that, you know, like moving forward from that cultural hegemonization. So the same way as I myself was reflecting so much on this, I used to listen to, you know, like Luis Fonsi and be like, that is reggaeton, which now I'm very much like, maybe it's not, you know, like reggaeton is a genre that has so much history and that stems from so many different places, and or just being like, you know, this is like a Latino genre, and it's kind of like, but what is that identity anyway? It's the same as saying like Arab. Like, what is Arab? Like, what is, you know, like Lebanon is so different from Syria, which is so different from the UAE, which is so different from Egypt. So it's kind of like, I think before, transnationalism used to be kind of like that idea of, you know, all those world cultures. And now it's moving towards that critical angle of where is that othering that comes with that idea of transnational, and as well that homogenization of cultures when you're talking about like cultural consumption of music, and kind of like putting it in a box, like having those big categories. First Latinx artists, or like, you know,
Yeah.
first Arab artists to break into the Western like charts of music, and so
Yeah. And
yeah,
it's
so please.
kind of funny because I don't know if you're familiar with like pop crave, como pop bass, these like
Yes.
pop culture accounts on Twitter particularly. There is like a amongst audiences online particularly, there is like a, I wouldn't say need, but there is como a liking towards these como very specific accomplishments that in some cases there is como merit to them.
Yes, of course, of course.
Te quería mencionar algo en particular sobre esta idea, ok, pues que in one of my classes I took on appreciation and criticism of contemporary art, where we did discuss the idea of like the problematization, por decirlo así, of these ideas like the global south, how art made in South America in particular, pues is seen as exotic coming from the north. O sea que personas de
Mm,
Estados Unidos, Europa, pues sí tienden a ver este arte como otro tipo de arte y no lo evalúan o lo aprecian desde los mismos estándares que lo hacen como para arte suyo. And I think now, especially with like social media, there is like a positive lens you could como give to the idea
yes,
of like transnationalism, because at the end of the day, it's como I think it's positive to learn more about different
of
cultures.
course.
Pues artistas como Bad Bunny pues permiten ese tipo de como
Yes,
introducción. Sí,
yes.
there are como debates here in Puerto Rico. O sea, when I tell you that people debate Bad Bunny in Puerto Rico, como this is like a como constant topic of discussion, particularly on social media. Y ahora pues recientemente pues ayer fue él va a tener unos conciertos en junio. I got stuck in line. I did not get those tickets, sadly. Pero,
No.
pero there was a sense of like, oh, people from other countries shouldn't be able to buy these tickets. These tickets should be como exclusive
Mm,
for Puerto Ricans, which is like, No, o sea, there are ways to como manage that accessibility to tickets, but the idea of like separating or categorizing is something como I take a little bit of issue with, but it comes down to the idea of how pues, ahora with social media we are able to access so much
Yes.
information at the same time that allows us to hopefully learn more about other cultures in a way that is empowering and in a way that doesn't polarize us towards como controversial and conservative angles, hopefully.
Yeah.
Con este
I think
algoritmo.
I think it's very interesting because for me it's like it's always interesting to understand like I mean obviously you can't write a thesis every time something like this happened, but like to kind of understand why this line of thought, because if I try to relate it, it's that idea that then people feel very like possessive of their culture, and I think that it comes quite a lot in those instances because it's kind of like that again double-edged sword that I feel like because of that global village and because of the fact that we are now kind of all interconnected and there's so much movement. So everyone is traveling, everyone kind of like has friends from different culture, conversations or encounters with people from different cultures. So then you kind of also become a bit of that puzzle of different cultures. I mean, I can say it for my own that like, I've like all the people around me that I'm so close to, like their cultures just have such a big place in my heart. So I think that it's so important to have a space for, as you said, like that sharing of cultures. But then I do think that there's kind of that critical angle of it, and that's something that we were talking about before, like what is the responsibility that comes with that, in the sense of, so like a lot of people now, for instance, like with everything that's happening, I mean, Palestine is a really big thing that I wanted to talk about as well. And in the sense that it's kind of, people are saying, like everyone that uses like Habibi all the time, for example, or like that Habibi is like this like nickname that we use quite a lot. And then, like I see those videos quite a lot on TikTok. There's this new trend now that it's with this song called like Shik Shak Shok. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's a video that is like I'll send you some of those videos. So it's kind of like and then this one song as well, like it's that idea that some people were saying that, like, the use of all of that culture and the appreciation of all of that culture, because it is a culture that, I mean, obviously, again, you can't homogenize Arab culture and you can't homogenize Arab identity, but in the Arab identity is something that has always as well been quite tied to the Palestinian cause, and the idea that there is kind of like this attempt of squashing that culture and taking that culture and appropriating that culture. So I think people feel very strongly in that sense that this culture represents something, and kind of like using it or appreciating it or listening to it also kind of comes with that responsibility of the awareness of the political implications that come with it, because it's kind of like it's a culture that we're fighting so hard to preserve, and we fought so hard to like even my generation, like everyone makes it such a point that like we're Arab, like we speak in Arabic, and like like listening to those songs that even myself sometimes growing up, I grew up looking down upon, being like, oh, this culture that like Western culture and like those artists are so much better, and this is something I don't like. And then suddenly, especially in Lebanon after October 17th, I mean, I'm listening to Fairuz and Rahbani and Warda and just kind of like connecting with my heritage more, because it's just so important to preserve, and because there are such strong political implications to it. And so I think that, I mean, from my understanding, because of course I cannot talk at all about the case of Puerto Rico, but from some of the kind of interviews that I had as well, I think there is that sentiment also of, kind of like, you're dancing to these songs and you're enjoying these songs and you're singing them without knowing what they mean necessarily. And it's great, but then, in parallel, kind of like that dichotomy, like you're listening to this in the US and enjoying it and going to the concerts and so, but then you're not aware that, the US is oppressing Puerto Rico in X, Y, Z, Z manner, so it's kind of like
Issues arise with like cuando lo decontextualizan. I think that's como the bottom line with people that do take are critical on the idea of transnationalism is the idea that cultures could be como decontextualized or perhaps como people interpret them in ways that are not entirely accurate to the reality
mhm, mhm.
of the people actually living these cultures. So que I think eso es como un problema que se enfrenta cualquier artista que como decide sacar música, por ejemplo, en like in this example, because it's like once it's out there, it's like you could have your own intention, your own message, but once it's out there, it kind of runs the risk of being interpreted in any way that the person might want to. So that's another one of the reasons why I really did enjoy your thesis, because that idea of like actually taking the time and kind of and wanting to make the study from the perspective of listeners tanto de Puerto Rico como de Líbano, para así como not just based off your own perspective on the subject, rather than like looking for other perspectives. And I think that again represents one of the good things about como being able to access information in this day and age, because it's like hopefully people are inspired to do that type of work and to access and to kind of appreciate art beyond just como the personal identification they have with it. I wanted to mention something. We mentioned como perreo and dancing, and it's something that's mentioned in your thesis. There's a quote that says como protests have been, in some instances, been substituted by raves and partying. Y quería mencionarte esto because en el verano del 2019, something that happened that was very como subversive and in a way it's funny, but it did como represent a lot of como the sentiment, fue el perreo combativo, que fue aquí en Puerto Rico, where essentially como a group of people just decided to hold like a perreo session in front of this like
Love it.
I think the oldest church in Old San Juan. So it kind of became this iconography of like esta actividad que puede parecer ridículo para unas personas, pero está representando algo en estos momentos. Y como
Yeah.
we can talk about how perreo is in a way a taboo subject still. It's something that elitist people would classify as something como without class or something that's como derogatory. So que eso fue algo súper trascendental. Un lens para añadirle a esto, el queer lens. I love a good applying
Yes.
queer lens to things, because algo que sucede mucho en Puerto Rico, pues oftentimes people who are marginalized are the ones como raising their voices and kind of leading these types of efforts. So you see a lot of intersection between, you have people that aren't only facing the issues of like the blackouts or like no tener el agua por día y cosas así, pero también pues meanwhile they're also confronting the issues that arise of being a gay man in Puerto Rico,
Sí.
of being a queer person here in Puerto Rico. So el perro combativo, I'm gonna take the bet to say que it was mostly queer people that participated in it, and I think it's a good representative of this idea of like taking something that is used in como otro contexto and using it as like a political statement. We also did ballrooms. I remember that otras cosas que se hicieron ahí mismo en el Viejo San Juan, pues fue como queer organizations and queer people came together to hold ballrooms combativos, so they would have los voguing sessions, las pasarelas y todo eso hecho en una plaza pública, porque en ese momento era como una manera para expresar ese sentimiento. And I bring this too because historically in Puerto Rico, back when it was still under Spanish colonial reign, hubo un gobernador que estableció el gobierno de las 3B, le decían, baile, botella y baraja. Because he said that un pueblo que baila, un pueblo distraído, so que you can keep them at bay if you distract them with like alcohol, if you distract them with gambling. And I think it's interesting to see ir de ese punto ahora, que es como que, mira, pero dancing is a way to kind of express political sentiment.
Yes.
Yes, there is alcohol involved sometimes in these activities, but it's the idea of like these things that were used to oppress us in a moment are being como reclaimed and broadcasted to express our como political sentiments, particularmente en el contexto del verano del 2019, so que encontré como esa parte como bien interesante.
Sí, no, he visto eso del periodo combativo, me encantaba mucho, porque representa también, creo, una gran parte de que he hablado con mis entrevistadores libaneses, porque también teníamos en las protestas de 2019 que el partying era también un gran elemento de eso, y mucha gente lo criticaron y como que they made fun of that, porque estaban como que, eso no es una revolución, que ustedes estaban haciendo una fiesta. There was a DJ, like at some point, I'll send you some videos, but like there was an actual DJ and then people were there and they were just like screaming and dancing. And I think on one hand, it's because people wanted to make it a point that, you know, they wanted to protest kind of like non-violently. But then at the same time, I think, I mean, dancing and partying, it's such a big element of Lebanese life and culture. And it's such a big element of our identity and how we express things and how we connect with one another. And so I think having, for me, in my point of view, having that in the protest and in the revolution is just another element of kind of like affirming that identity. And it's also quite representative. So then when the crisis happened and then all these things started to happen. So Lebanon, Beirut specifically is quite known for its nightlife. We have like a really big techno scene and like just lots of bars and clubs. And it's such a big thing. And it's just that idea that, you know, like the tougher things get, the more people party. It's very dystopian for me but it also makes a lot of sense because like you're living in the state that you don't know when things are going to go wrong from one day to the next. You're living like literally like, I think particularly after the August 4th explosion, it happened on a random Tuesday at like 6 p.m.
I remember como the videos and different como perspectives.
I mean, so yeah, someone even like in this really famous like restaurant was just like filming it and had this like view, and then another person was on a boat just enjoying their day, and then just out of nowhere, like in literally like 30 seconds, like everything just completely changed. Obviously, there's quite a lot that comes with this. No one knows exactly what happened in this day. Obviously, governmental mismanagement for having the explosive at the port, and then a lot of evidence points to the fact that it wasn't an accident. So lots of people had heard planes as well during that day. So potential explosion and detonation kind of like from an Israeli drone. So no one really knows what happened. There's obviously a lot of people that are at fault. I think a lot of people lost their sense of safety that point in time, because it's like, you know, these explosives had been in the heart of the capital city since 2013. So it's like all this time that we were going to restaurants, and it's very much in that area where a lot of the bars and the restaurants and kind of like that life is concentrated. So we were just all like living there, going there, coming, completely unaware of that. And it could have happened
At any
any
time.
moment.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that's also why I related quite a lot to, I mean, obviously it's completely different contexts with Hurricane Maria, but it's kind of like that idea that like, you know, like things just change out of nowhere from one day to the next. And then you also, I mean, not only is the government at fault, and then you can't rely on them for anything. So like when there were searches for people that were still under the rubble, like it's people that took care of that. The second day of the explosion, people came down to the streets to start picking up the rubbles, where you had pictures of some politicians in suits that were looking at the architecture and potential investment plans, you know? So it's kind of like a lot of this anger of like, how do you, one, put us in a situation like this, and two, like how do you have even more damage from having that governmental mismanagement? And not just that, people went to protest after, because it was just like, what the hell, like how can something like this happen? It was like some of the biggest and angriest protests that we've had, and then the army just came down face to face with protesters, and then so many people were injured from those protests. Imagine like 4 days after like the biggest explosion, and then people come down to protest, and the army has the guts to face, I mean, obviously under the orders of the government, to come face to face with the people and to start shooting at them in the ruins of the city. Like it was just so dystopian. I think it changed people so much. I mean, it changed Lebanese people. I mean, it's obviously still very much a big collective trauma, but then it's also that like that it's like death happened, like, and then that huge catastrophe happened, like right in the center and the heart of that capital city that is usually so full of life. And it just created that push and pull in Lebanon that, like, you know, like the more unsafety you have, like the more I think people just want to party and enjoy life to the maximum.
It is kind of like a coping mechanism in a way that
It is.
of partying.
And a lot of people always try to look down on this, in the sense like lots of people who criticize it and be like, you know, like, oh, like, look, like Lebanon is going through a crisis and people are just partying. And it's kind of like, yeah, but people need that. Like people need to still be able to kind of like, in order to face all of these catastrophes that are happening in the country. And I think that's why I like that idea of like pereo combativo, you know, because for me, I do think that culture, art and music is resistance. And I do think that in a lot of ways, it just expresses so much more. I mean, anyway, in general, right? Like body language, dancing, like it's just able to express so much more than sometimes we do in words. And I think that's why for me it was also interesting from that angle. So putting aside the very direct political message of songs like El Apagón, something that did came out in the interviews was, for some Lebanese listeners, like that idea that there's so many sexual taboos as well in Lebanon. And so kind of like listening to a song that is very, very explicit in a Lebanese context, but that people in Lebanon don't understand.
Lebanese people hearing la lírica como me gusta la chocha de Puerto Rico, it's like como
Yeah.
how are they interpreting that? Como how are they como receiving that message? As funny as it is, como I think the crassness of that lyric adds to the idea of the song being so openly embracing a Puerto Rico, como so much so que pues lo está representando a través de como the sexual aspect of it. Que en Puerto Rico se habla mucho, de nuevo, particularly among queer circles, the idea of like sexual liberation as like a front to political adversity. Puerto Rico also does have like a collective trauma con el huracán María. There's like this como silent clutching every como August to October because it's like, what if another hurricane of that magnitude comes como, o sea, I still remember como the day right after the hurricane, people kept saying how it looked like a bomb had like como exploded and bared el paisaje de Puerto Rico, because it did look like that. It did look like a fire had gone towards the woods. So it was this very como moment of like, shit, we're fucked essentially. So como a este sentido de, apart from kind of like a cognitive dissonance in the sense of people are also kind of ignoring it and hoping it doesn't happen, while also being like, you know, if it does happen, that will, I don't want to say ruin our country again, pero como sería devastating in more ways than one. Entiendo muy bien the idea of like a collective trauma and the anxiety that kind of arises from the idea that, you know, this could happen at any moment. And we sadly have no control over it, and the people that are supposed to be managing it and be preventing disasters pues are not doing that. Quería entonces ahora talk a little bit about como the idea of like active audiences and how that como has influenced music consumption in particular, or media consumption as a whole, because particularmente for those listeners out there, if y'all remember el episodio de Taylor Swift, The Eras Tour, where I talked about Omar Rincon. Essentially, he was talking about particularly by using television as an example of how people started developing ways to influence the things they would see represented in media, be that through criticism, being that through cosas como veedurías, que esencialmente son como focus groups designed to kind of determine what people want and don't want to be seen on television. And I think particularly now with social media, the internet, the instant access we have to information, tanto recibirla como transmitirla, pues has given people the feeling that they can influence more what they see represented. So you see a lot more como people directly addressing artists online and saying what they like and don't like about them. So I wanted to see como how the idea of active audiences tied into your study.
I mean, that's my personal opinion again, not related to my study, but I mean, audiences are very much extremely active and hold a lot of power nowadays. And I think it kind of goes back as well to what we were talking about before in terms of a bit more of kind of like a cultural hegemony, as opposed to now, you know, kind of like those big cultural companies needing to essentially bend a bit more in between quotation marks to what people want rather than them kind of directly imposing the consumption of culture. And so that is a big core concept that I used in my dissertation. So there's this kind of school of thought that started with Stuart Hall and a couple of other scholars that essentially moved from the typical model of how essentially like a message was being transmitted to an audience, from being very much so directly linear. So you had like the medium itself, and then let's say the cultural show or music or so, that was kind of like very much encoded with a message. So, you know, this show is saying that apples are important to eat, whatever, like very random example. And then, so this is what I'm writing. And then audiences are understanding that message and they're absorbing that message as it is. And that's it. So that model kind of very much had that focus and that power on essentially the production side of things. And then that audiences were just really gullible and we just essentially sat there in that movie theater and just absorbed everything that was given to us. Is that idea that actually like that decoding of the message, like the encoding decoding model, doesn't always happen in that way, that you may encode the message in a certain way and kind of like say something, but then people on the other side of things are going to decode it and understand it very much so based on, you know, their own cultural context and their own cultural backgrounds. And I think that was kind of like the stepping stone for me, because it was really interesting to see, like, because Bad Bunny's music, and that's why it's titled, like everything about Bad Bunny's music is so Puerto Rican. It's very much a music that is imbued in Puerto Rican culture. And it was just really interesting to me to be like, okay, like, is that message that he's intending being received by audiences that could potentially receive it in that way? Because for me, it didn't make sense, for instance, to kind of like have, I mean, the thing is, there's so many angles that you could take with this, and that's something I would personally love to do eventually, obviously, because there's just so many different cultural comparisons that you can do. So like, it would be interesting to see people whose culture is closer, like people in the Caribbean, for example. I think that would be really interesting to kind of like see how that music is decoded. And then I think there were some studies also done from that idea, maybe not with reggaeton or Bad Bunny particularly, but with, a certain cultural genre, and then, people from that culture and people from a more Western culture, and like people from a more collective culture versus people from a more like, I forgot what the other
Individuals.
word is. Individualistic, yes, exactly. But for me, it was interesting to see, like, obviously there's a language barrier, but it was more about the lived experiences and the sentiments that is being sang in Bad Bunny songs, and kind of like what is making people connect with that so much. And on the contrary, like, are people understanding what he's saying? And the people that are not, what is it about his music that they are encoding and they're understanding that is kind of like pulling them to it so much? So I think for me, that was the angle that I took in terms of the active audiences, in the sense of like, how does your personal background and your cultural background influence the way that you consume media, but then specifically media that is very much so cultural. And I think that's what is so different with Bad Bunny. And a lot of the research that I did was really interesting for me as well, to understand reggaeton as a genre, because especially I know that now, that word is thrown so much, and I know that so many people are like, no, that's actually not considered reggaeton if you go back to like its origin. And reggaeton is very much like a black genre, and it has such a history of resistance and such a history of, as you said, like moving as well from that like elitist view on music, and it was being looked down on upon so much historically, and now, it's such a big and popular and commercialized genre. So it's like, I lost my flow of thought.
Te entiendo. I do.
I just got so into this, I
No,
lost
pero
completely my
you're
flow of
saying
thought.
that you're eating that shit up, o sea, so no te preocupes. I did wanna to highlight another one of like part of the writing that you mentioned. Authenticity is often attributed to experience of a certain culture, entre paréntesis, can also be linked back to colonial nostalgia pushed by marketing and commercialization. And I found that interesting because we do como, particularly now, estamos como enfrentando la idea de que, mira, pues efectivamente, being culturally aware is in a way marketable. It's in a way como, it's in a way what audiences right now seem to be demanding. The idea of
Yes.
this artist I'm looking up to is representative of a reality that I'm living in, que no se ve solamente en Bad Bunny, o sea, como historically, but certain audiences do como fixate or grow a support for a certain artist because of what they represent. Ahora mismo estoy pensando en Lady Gaga, por ejemplo,
Yes.
as a gay man, o sea, como con ella, desde un principio pues tuve esa como esa fijación porque era, mira, como que esto es un artista que está como representando una realidad o está extendiendo un cierto apoyo hacia mí por yo ser parte de esta comunidad. Therefore, entonces, pues trae la idea de, ok, who is being authentic and who is being como a marketing ploy. Y Bad Bunny, particularmente en Puerto Rico, o sea, como él tiene tanto sus lovers como sus haters, so como parte
Sí.
de los haters sí hay como ese sentimiento de él lo hace por los chavos, él lo hace por estas cosas, que a veces yo como que, I feel like the idea of like doing it for the money is kind of like, aren't we all doing things for the money? Pero creo que particularmente como en este caso entre los artistas, pues sí se ha habido ese como, that debate over how much is actually authentic and how much is just como part of like the commercial
Mm.
aspect of this artist. Obviously, you have como the conversations around como appropriation of certain sounds and how como
Yes.
artista de afuera, por decirlo así, o artista
Mm.
europeo, artista norteamericano, are incorporating, por ejemplo, reggaeton sounds into their music, which I think como is a positive thing if you go como por la línea de the idea of like cultural exchange. These are people that perhaps are working with Puerto Rican producers. Aquí pensando en Rosalía. me,
Sí.
me always ready to defend Rosalía. Pero I bring it up because de nuevo it goes back to that debate of, pues mira, these things can be good, por decirlo así, but the idea of esta apropiación pueda decontextualizar o misinterpret the original material, pues es what people have como a certain issue with. En esa misma línea, poco después del quote que I just read, you write que artists are influenced by their social political context, their work in turn influences culture and society, que de aquí es donde viene entonces o se ve reflejado por la idea de la responsabilidad de los artistas en representar
Sí.
auténticamente como calidad. Particularly right now, I've seen pues, people discussing over whether or not artists should be como commenting on the Palestine conflict right now, como people demanding that people take open positions on that subject. You mentioned it earlier, que I would like to talk about it if you have como some perspectives to share on the topic, because again, it's like a perfect example of how active audiences, pues entonces, engage with their artists now. And it's not only they're passively consuming their music, they're also como, they have like a personal investment in them and want them to como
Yes.
use their position for good, por decirlo así.
So I think for me, the way that I see it, again, my very much personal viewpoints and opinions, but obviously there's a really big demand on artists because it's kind of like that idea of that there is a responsibility. And in one way or another, kind of like that neutrality, it's kind of like an illusion, right? Like those artists that are like, I'm not going to be involved in anything because as an artist, I'm going to kind of cater to as many audiences as possible. So it's kind of like, I think a lot of our generation and audiences now are really demanding that artists start to become more politically involved because they're aware of the power that they have and kind of like the power that they have to speak up on topics that are extremely important. Again, that obviously is being capitalized on and it's being in a lot of places you can feel that it's being used just because artists have to, like, right? Like it's not because that artist is particularly like kind-hearted and really cares about this cause, but just because they know that if they don't do that, then audiences are going to be like, exactly, or like they're going to lose followers or followings or whatever. So for me personally, like, I've always been the kind of person that I like authenticity in the sense of like, just kind of a very basic like honesty standpoint. And I think that for me, it's just that idea of, just kind of like saying things as they are. And just to go back, for example, like you were talking about like Taylor Swift, for instance. I mean, again, that is my personal opinion, not to generalize on anything, but I used to have a lot of respect for the fact that she was political. I mean, Miss Americana, like the whole documentary is essentially that idea that, like her voice has been taken away from her. And because of that whole mean of production and that whole, mechanics of that industry that she's in, that she really even can't speak. And that, like she's always had this like very nice girl image and so on. And that her politics are so important to her and that she really wants to use that voice. And she did, like, especially since, having her whole comeback and just like having gone through everything that happened, the whole Kardashian, Taylor Swift is cancelled. And then just coming back from, so I, for me, that is something that I had so much respect for because it's like, she's like, I'm taking back my music and my power essentially. And with power comes having a voice, right? Which is what she always wanted. And so it's like being political in that sense is she very much is that someone that says, I want to be political. And then in some cases she is, but then for instance, like, obviously, she hasn't taken any kind of stance when it comes to Palestine. And my viewpoint on it is because, I think also kind of like looking critically at the stances in between brackets that she's taken before, a lot of them go in line with her audience. It's kind of like very much so, like what she considers to be like feminist stances and very much kind of like LGBTQIA plus pro and allyship stances. And it's kind of like, I think what happens when, there's like tougher stances to be taken that necessarily are a bit more risky and are going to put your career at a bit more risk, or you're less able to cater to like that broader audience. So like, I think most Taylor Swift fans would consider themselves feminist, if you can, generalize or take that word like that strongly, yeah. Right? But then there's such a division in opinion when it comes to Palestine. So it's like, okay, like, is she going to take that step or is she going to stay in that like neutrality in between brackets? And then how much control does she have over that voice as opposed to what forces are driving behind it. And I think just to kind of like link it back to Bad Bunny, like I think for me that's why it's that idea of authenticity, because I don't think that Bad Bunny ever claimed to carry on his shoulder any political fight. The way that I see it is like when I see Bad Bunny at the Rico Denuncia protests, like I see a citizen that has lived in Puerto Rico, everything that he sings about. And that's something that came out in the interviews quite a lot. Like it's a question that I had asked, and it's like, why do you trust Bad Bunny to carry that representation? Like, why do you feel like this is a trust you're putting in his hand? Because it really is a big trust. Like it's not an easy place to say that this person represents my culture or this person represents my experience. And a lot of people said it's because I know that he's lived whatever he's singing about. Like he used to work at a supermarket. Like he really came from like that background that a lot of us can relate to, and whatever experiences he's had before his fame, all of us can relate to it. And when he talks about, like, I think it was like Padilla, if I'm not mistaken, like that pizza chain that people were like in the songs, and then he talks about racing in Puerto Rico. And so it's like all these things that they're like, he's not bullshitting because he's
He's
lived
coming
it.
from
And
like an authentic place, and I think
so
that's part of why Puerto Ricans have developed that special connection to him. Because at the end of the day, como it does feel como a contemporary, like a peer, singing about experiences that particularly our generation has experienced. That's why I think in his interviews he does como express the idea de que él como que no se reconoce como un activista, por decirlo así, como que
sí,
I wouldn't call it neutral, but he does como make the emphasis that he's speaking from experience, o sea, que su música viene de una experiencia y que esa experiencia lo que termina siendo político y social. Que esto pues, me lleva a la idea de direct political messages in songs versus the idea of like, como lo dice, subtle and effective sentiments. Because I feel que if we take Taylor Swift, for example, ella es una persona que su música does como rely more on the sentimental aspect of it, como lo que ella está tratando de expresar, por decirlo así. Y en las canciones donde es un poco más crítica y un poco más como directa, pues son canciones que are related to ideas of feminism, ideas of like her place in the music industry. Que I think que por eso conmigo, or from my perspective, pues I would expect her more to talk about those things, given that it's her experience.
yes.
But when it comes to things like Palestine, I would understand why she suddenly como perhaps won't say anything about it, or why tiene, como lo digo.
She's
There's like
reluctant to.
exacto, she's reluctant because there is like a political economic implication to her saying that could be not a benefit to her. And I say this not in a way to like defend her silence, but more so como explain
Explain, yeah.
realmente como it is a thing about the economic aspect of it. It is a thing about
It 100% is.
maintaining a sense of like I can't say something that will anger my audience or make me have to explain myself beyond what I have already como explained in my music, por ejemplo, así. Entonces pues pienso también en otros artistas como Madonna, Lady Gaga, que are artists that have a more direct political messaging in their songs, and therefore that's why I feel like there are artists that are more como intensely studied when it comes to their music, because if you something that happens a lot, o por lo menos así yo as like a Taylor Swiftologist, es que pues, I feel que oftentimes como the study of her music is more like acercándose a como lo que representa for the music industry, or como whenever I read the coverage of like her becoming the first musician to be person of the year by Time magazine, como her breaking all those records con sus Taylor's versions and all that, pues sí hay como una atención muy dada a ese aspecto de como, es que ella she has a lot of influence over the music industry. Meanwhile, when you read up on Madonna, Lady Gaga, pues son artistas que have a much more como cultural, social, political analysis to it. Que eso me parece interesante, and it's the basis for Medio Raro in a lot of ways.
But that's what I find interesting also about Bad Bunny, because for me, he's like the mix of both, right? Like Bad Bunny also, I think in the recent years, like Bad Bunny and Taylor Swift were like, I think
Head to
if we
head.
look, I mean, I would have to, yeah, we'll have to look at the charts, but like they were kind of like like the top artists in that sense. And I think that's what I find so interesting about Bad Bunny, because for him, it's kind of like he didn't go around saying like I want to break walls, or like I want to be political, or I want to change things in Puerto Rico, or like I want to do this and that, and this is what I'm doing. Like I think his attitude is very much like, I mean, como el album, right? Like yo hago lo que me da la gana. Like a lot of the times, like even in his interviews, he's like, I don't care. I'm going to speak Spanish in interviews. Like if the other person speaks in English, then their problem. And then one thing that I've written also in my dissertation, that he's like, like I always knew that I would be able to make it while being true to my culture, and still singing in Spanish and singing kind of like the experiences of Puerto Rico. He kind of is being seen as that same element of like that kind of like breakthrough, because before, that idea of like transnational music, like when all of this started, like when we're looking at like Ricky Martin and Shakira and all those artists that kind of like started there, like there was that idea that they needed to cross over in order to be digestible to more Western audiences. So they need to to sing in Spanish, and, kind of like that homogenization of culture. And I think, there's also a paper that talks quite a lot about the differences in how Luis Fonsi represents Puerto Rico in Despacito in the video clip, as opposed to like how Bad Bunny does it in another video clip, and kind of like that romanticization and that kind of like
I'm gonna go out
ish.
on a limb and say that I think Despacito contributed to gentrification in Puerto Rico in a lot of
Yeah,
ways.
there is a paper that talks about that, and a lot of people kind of talk about that idea, and that's when we talk about like authenticity, and when you're talking about kind of like the responsibility that comes with carrying a culture or like representing a certain place, because I mean it does have a ripple effect. And obviously you can't predict that ripple effect, but it's kind of, I think that's why Bad Bunny is so big, because it's kind of like that idea of someone being that popular and that commercial in between brackets, but while at the same time being authentic and like really stemming out directly of Puerto Rico, so like it's so representative of so many things. That's why he's being studied so much, and I think will be studied, I think, even more so. And I think that's at least my reasoning for picking him, because it's like this person, like that's why I was like, why Bad Bunny particularly? Because it's like I do know that everyone listens to Bad Bunny in one way. I mean, everyone, general statement, but his songs are quite popular, and I'm sure that in Lebanon people listen to him, and he has fans in Lebanon. And then why him particularly when looking at cultural consumption of music, because his music is so cultural, like it's so imbued in the Puerto Rican experience, and it's so imbued in like even the language. Like I've spoken, that would be such an interesting study in and of its own, linguistically, but like I've spoken to a lot of my other Spanish speaking friends, and they were like, a lot of the things that he sings we don't even understand, like we don't even know. Like I would ask them, for example, like like what does this sentence mean, and they'll be like, I don't know. So it's kind of like even that idea of, like the slang, the language, everything he uses was made in a way that it's like, this is my music, take it or leave it.
It's gonna mean something different to Puerto Ricans than it means to como international listeners or listeners.
Yes.
And
I
even
found that so nice, because it's kind of like that secret in between brackets, because like one of my interviewees said this, and I, resonated with it a lot, that in the sense is like it extended an invitation to you to be like, here is me kind of presenting that experience, and here's me kind of like presenting that culture and that history. And then you also have a responsibility to kind of like take that step. And when we're talking about active audiences, like I think it's kind of the layers that comes with being an active audience in a way, because it's kind of like, yes, on one hand, we very much have a lot of power in being like, this is what we want to listen to. And like, it's important for us that artists take political stances, and it's important for us that culture is not stereotyped, and, like there's an authentic representation. And what does that mean? Does it mean that it has to be someone from the culture, from that experience singing it? Like, what does it mean to carefully or well represent a culture? But then there's also that idea that I also have responsibility as a listener and a consumer to be like, what am I listening to? A lot of my interviewees, Lebanese actually, did say that, like, because I was asking a lot of questions in the sense of, like instinctively, like, where is Bad Bunny from? Where would you say that Bad Bunny is from? And so some people would be like, yeah, Puerto Rico, but then I would know much more about that. And I was like, okay, what can you tell about Puerto Rico from his songs? And they would be like, not much. Like for me, it always gave me an idea of Latin America as a whole. So it's kind of like, and I'm talking as someone that also made that transition, right? Like from starting to research way more and understand way more, what does that music come from? And I think, again, I think I lost the original flow of this, but I think that's why he is such an interesting case because it's kind of like he's being political not by being like I want to be political, but by being like as a citizen of Puerto Rico and as someone that has lived through all of these things, these are the stances that I want to take as a person, not because I want to represent myself as the voice of Puerto Rico, but because this is what I think and this is what I want to do. And then people relate to it because they live the same things and then they relate to his songs and then they're like, we also think the same way.
That's what makes this music inherently political, because it does come from us
Yes.
actually experiencing the things he's singing about. And this made me think about another quote of yours that says, como, the codings of certain cultural mediums can contain ambiguities and so be polysemic. There is also importance in like the personal connection we como end up having con estas canciones and how we apply it to ourselves in our daily lives, how we apply it to como our ideas of society. And I think that's part of the beauty of music. I think it's one of the most como the more accessible forms of art
Yes.
media. I really do appreciate that recognition of how mira como it does have like an inherent meaning, but there's also value in the other types of meanings people are getting, particularmente en la música de Bad Bunny, como estaba explicando que pues no solamente es relevante para una persona en Puerto Rico la idea de los apagones, sino someone in Lebanon can be like, mira, yo también experimento estas cosas, yo también experimento lo que es como corrupción política. This is something that connects us in a way that transcends como ese language barrier, which I find como very compelling. Which brings me to como esta pregunta que I want us to ponder over. If music is something that can bring political change, mucho ojo, eso era uno de los stickers de Medio Raro originalmente. So I thought it was like the perfect time to discuss it because it's something como that goes back to people demanding artists to take political stances. I think that shows that people do recognize that music is something that can bring political change, por decirlo así, pero también está el lado más como literal, que es como que, mira, this song may be #1 on Spotify, but we still have a corrupt government. ¿Cómo crees que la música puede influir en las personas y su pensamiento? Como I would like to hear your thoughts on that.
I also think that this is a very personal question, and I'm going to answer it from that personal lens because I think it could change from one person to another, depending on how you define political change. And it goes back to what I was talking about as well with the October 17th revolution, right? Like if you ask some people, they would tell you no change happened. Like, what did we do? We went down on the streets for 3 months. And then like, if you look at it from that lens, yeah, the government is still the same. The situation is even worse than it was before. So it's like some people are like, what happened? But I think that for me, I really believe a lot in that change at a really, really, really micro level, like from one person to another, from small cracks in societies to another. And then that kind of like slowly starts building up to broader change with time. And I do think that I mean, for me, 100% music can bring that change. And then it depends what you mean by political, right? Because even me growing up, like for the longest time, I used to be like, I'm not a political person because I grew up being like, politics in Lebanon are corrupt and I don't want anything to do with that. And anyone that touches politics is corrupt and whatever. So then it was kind of that understanding that being political is not just about running for elections, or it's not just about voting, or it's not just about going to protests, right? Like I think everything is political, like, and that's why I think now audiences are way more demanding from artists that kind of like involvement, because I think that before it was that idea that art and politics are completely separate and that they mustn't overlap, and that, you know, in order to appeal to the masses, like you have to be as neutral as possible in between brackets. But there is such a strong history of art and resistance happening through art because of that idea, right? That you can pass subtle messages, particularly in places where you would, I mean, not everyone has the luxury of being able to go and protest and be like, this is what I want. Because if they do that, then maybe their lives are threatened, right? But then the ability to be able to pass those subtle messages and to reach people in places that you wouldn't necessarily be able to reach them, like through music or through art or through anything, that is I think it's quite powerful. If I'm thinking, I don't know, like, yeah, I think if I think about Bad Bunny, like I think what I was looking for in my dissertation was that thought that, you know, like people were listening to El Apagón with the context of the October 17th revolution and kind of like connecting with that idea. And I had a participant, you know, that they were like, you know, when I'm listening to like que se vayan ellos, you know, I may not be thinking about the same ellos that the song is referring to, but I have my own AOS in Lebanon, like, talking about those politicians that are eating up my country, and because of them, I have to leave. So I was like, yeah, that is so interesting to me because it's that bridge of resistance and of countries that can kind of like understand these experiences. And then, I've been seeing so many people in Puerto Rico that have been holding protests for Palestine because, it's kind of like we understand that experience that is being lived. So I had come from that idea that the apagón is. But I think it was so interesting to me because, a lot of people didn't know El Apagón that I interviewed, Again, I had also a very small pool of data and can't make any generalizations, or people just didn't understand the lyrics. So I have to say as well, like, for instance, like the fact that, obviously I did a lot of research, but then I was able to hold discussions with people from Puerto Rico that were kind of really giving me that experience and that background. So a lot of people of my participants didn't really know the political similarities between Lebanon and Puerto Rico. But then that came out quite strongly, that idea that what they like about Bad Bunny's music is yo hago lo que me da la gana. Like, it's kind of like in a country that has so much repression and so many taboos, that is also change in and of itself and a revolution that we have been trying to bring as well, in the sense of like, when you're talking about bodily expression, when you're talking about, so people that were like, just listening to his songs, like it just makes me feel like, all those things that are considered like strong sexual taboos in Lebanon, like it just gives you that outlet to just be able to kind of like reflect on your culture through the lens of another culture. So it's kind of like that idea people were saying, like in Latin America, they're so comfortable talking about like sex in that manner, or like they're so comfortable like having songs out like this. And then like it's kind of like that aspiration. And even if it's not authentic, even if it's not correct, it's a generalization for sure, because reggaeton is not.
I don't have the exact quote, but along those lines, you do mention something how que la perspectiva de Lebanese listeners were como representative of like an imagined idea of Puerto Rico or like an imagined idea of South America. You make the distinction that sometimes people didn't differentiate between como Puerto Rico and South America and kind of just homogenizaba
Homogenized.
esa perspectiva que I don't think it's something exclusive to como Lebanese listeners. I also do feel que, por ejemplo, puertorriqueños pueden hacer eso mismo con música de Líbano, por ejemplo.
Sí,
So que sí existe como esa necesidad or that hope que pues people that listen to music from different cultures pues sí puedan como it can be relatable and how it also represents como a specific culture, a specific experience. I do agree a lot with you when you say how we define change and how como change something can be at a micro level. Pues pienso mucho on how it can happen in an individual level. Por ejemplo, I talk a lot about the album American Life by Madonna. So it's very critical of this idea of like the American life as she como explores in the album. So I say a lot because that was one of the albums that like radicalized me, because it was one of these albums that kind of como invited me to think critically of the things that como were going on and made me think critically of my own government, no solo el de Estados Unidos, sino también el de Puerto
sí.
Rico. So como I really do believe that music does have that impact of being able to como introduce new perspectives to people and being able to kind of invite people to think things differently. Y pues también como no solamente me como radicalizó políticamente, sino también it also includes a lot of como introspective lyrics about como also deconstructing our own biases and our own como perspectives. So ese álbum, Born This Way de Lady Gaga, Hard Candy de Madonna también. I don't know if you noticed, pero Madonna y Lady Gaga son mi artista favorita. I really do believe que I think that's one of the most powerful parts of music, the idea that this
Yes.
could como tener ese resultado, que yo creo que es distinto a verlo quizás como una necesidad de los artistas ser políticos y más bien es como el resultado de lo que ocurre when somebody is authentic in the things they're expressing and sharing through their music. No es solamente música about partying, although I like that, o sea, no es que estamos aquí
Of
diciendo
course.
que es malo, pero así como hay ejemplos de música que incluyen estas referencias que sí, efectivamente, do influence people to think differently. I would say Lady Gaga was one of the reasons, so really brought to the forefront in the popular conversation the idea of like gay marriage. Como she really did bring to the forefront a lot of como LGBT issues que siento que pues venían from like an authentic place of hers. Madonna en particular es una artista que to this day she continues to como include a lot of, and particularly in her como live shows, she does include a lot of como references to current political issues. She has a lot of interludes that kind of show visuals related to como what's going on. So fueron esas cosas así que in my formative years que sí me tuvieron un impacto en como, mira, así como, this did make me think about politics and myself in a different way, in a way that is fortunately pues como in favor of more radical and progressive ideals instead of como pues something that's distracting or something that pues is inauthentic to an experience people are having.
And it can be both, right? Like you can be partying, and I mean that's what I love, and that's what came out in my dissertation, like that multi-layer of Bad Bunny. That it's like, people are like, we love it because we can just, every time that song comes, everyone is just up on the dance floor and dancing and moving. So there is that side of it that, people are like, yeah, we just listen to it because it's so fun. Like we just love it and we love dancing to it. But then when you go deeper, it's like there's all of these layers that come behind it. Then there's the personal, as you said. So like so many people as well were telling me like, like that album represents to me a point in time where, I was really heartbroken. And then it's kind of like that's what Un Verano Sin Ti is also like. It's just so that whole shift of, it's political, but then it's also quite personal, and it talks so much about love and heartbreak, and then also just like so many layers of things. And I think that's why it's so powerful, because it's kind of like, here's a life that you're living on a day to day, and then that life that you're living is going to have heartbreaks, and then it's going to have political upheavals, and it's going to have apagones, and then it's also going to have just having fun and dancing and enjoying your time with your friends, and it's also going to have being tired from working all day long. So it's kind of like that kind of like representation of like, we're not just one thing, right? Like we're not just our politics, we're not just our identity, we're not just what we go through, we're not just our lived experiences. Like it's just so many things in one, and it's so multi-layered. And I think that the reason why he appeals to so many people is because everyone has something that they take out of it. And then again, like that political is very much personal as well. So it's like that's kind of the conclusion that I came from, like looking at those answers, because it's like people were not talking to me about the political of Bad Bunny's music, looking at like the apagones and the corruption in Lebanon, but they were talking about, how that is giving them an outlet to kind of break through some of the taboos that are so strong in Lebanon, because we don't have artists that talk as, let's say, like explicitly as like Bad Bunny would talk in songs. So it's kind of like, and then also even if they did, if they're singing in Arabic or singing in English, it's not something that you would easily blast in a public place, because there's still so much of that shame and that judgment. So then being able to like listen to Bad Bunny sing such explicit music and then dance to it and have that like kind of like, expression in and of itself, like I find that quite powerful, and it's kind of like a step towards change. And I mean, I do find it very critical and very, like that homogenization, and it's a big part of my thesis, that idea of like South American identity or like Latino identity or Arab identity, or but I think that's what I also found interesting, is that it kind of tells you something as well, that because it's kind of like that imagined idea and it's a comparison, right? That's why I think those cultural comparisons are so important, because it's like, here in Lebanon, this is how I've lived my experience in the society here, and then I see what I imagine the society to be, and this is what I would like to be as well. And it's interesting because people don't understand that reggaeton is very much subversive, and that like breaking those taboos, from what I understood, is also quite important in Puerto Rico. Like when we're talking about like the pereo combativo, what you just told me, like it's also quite radical in Puerto Rico, and as radical as it is to someone in Lebanon trying to break those taboos. And then I think that is that bridge that is missing. It's kind of like that research and those conversations and that understanding that it's like, actually we're trying to do the same things. Obviously the societies are very different, the cultures are very different, but like we connect with one another through that, through music, essentially.
En Puerto Rico, particularly in the queer community, como se habla mucho de sanar, como the idea of like hacer cosas por la sanación, which is se manifiesta en, pues, oftentimes people do como address perreo, address como parties as spaces where people go to heal, como where people go to como y sanan de su herida. So como oftentimes with a lot of friends of mine, we're always talking about como the steps we're taking to sanar at any given moment. Y pues it does come up a lot of how these spaces of dancing, of partying, of, let me say, a drug use, I believe in the positive and recreational use of drugs, ties into this idea of like, mira, we're looking to heal from these wounds that society created for us. It also serves as a way to como establish that we exist, establish that, we are here, por decirlo así. That's what I really liked about your thesis at the end of the day, that idea of how it highlighted cómo esta música está resonando para personas de culturas que se pueden como visualizar como distantes, pero they share a lot more similarities than one may think. And I wanted to ask you, como, going forward, como, what other topics are you interested in continuing to study? Como, would you like to continue studying Bad Bunny? Like, what do you see doing now?
I would love to have definitely broader, kind of like stemming from that same place of audience analysis, but then broader outlooks on I mean, one, having more Lebanese participants. I think I would love to see if, like this kind of like in terms of bigger pools and bigger numbers of people, and also different age groups and different generations, because I think that does make a really big difference, whether that's in Puerto Rico or in Lebanon. And then I think just having different multicultural comparisons. I mean, as I mentioned before, I think it's important to realize as well the positionality on things. So for me, I think I had enough information and kind of like acknowledge that positionality as a Lebanese, and then that cultural background that I have, and being able to do so. And I wouldn't want to kind of like cross that line of doing a culture, because I think that for me ethical cultural studies are so important, and it's a really big title and it's a really big thing to take on. And I mean, I tried my hardest. Obviously there's a lot of cracks and gaps, and it's still something that is very much, I would say, recent, and that is growing so much. And I think that I would really be mindful of that going forward, but I would really love to just understand so much more like what Bad Bunny's music, like how it's decoded by people of different cultures, because I just think that there's so much to be said behind that. Like I think there's so much that on the surface level looks like very simple, but then if you look underneath it, has so much to be said about culture, about politics, about aspiration, and particularly moving forward. I mean, I'm just interested in general in cultural media, and how that's changing and what audiences are requiring from it, and why it's so important, right? Because I feel like people need to have that representation, and people need to have that outlet, because it just helps to express identity so much. It helps to resist, it helps to express politics, and then also as well connect with similar cultures from around the world. Maybe not connect, maybe kind of like find places of, and that's what I was looking at as well. I was like, okay, the similarities, but then also the differences, because the differences tell us just as much essentially. So I would love to, I always say this, like, I feel like just I barely scratched the surface of things, and I would love to dig way deeper into. I mean, I think I love Bad Bunny, and I think even more so than Bad Bunny. I mean, not more so, it's very much connected, but Un Verano Sin Ti, I think for me, it's something that it's still very much recent, but I think there's so much about that album to kind of like explore and uncover. And yeah, just seeing this from the lens of people of different cultures, and those big themes that we talked about, right? Like the personal, the affective, the emotional, the political, and then what does culture mean and how is it changing and evolving since we're in that global village. And I think our identities are changing so much as well. So just, yeah, very, very interested and passionate about that, and looking to study it more, hopefully, eventually.
I'm excited to be a part of that in any way I can. I really appreciate your perspectives and your dedication como to digging deeper into these subjects. Quería saber si hay otra cosa that would you like to add?
I know I wanted to ask you, what are your aspirations moving forward for Medio Raro, and kind of all those topics that we talked about?
Um, I wasn't expecting this question. Well, definitely, I would love to keep doing this type of dynamic. Como I'm saying, I'm in my Zoom interview era, so I'm really looking forward to keep connecting with other people that are studying, that are interested in these types of subjects, because this is the type of conversation como that I set out to have when I started doing Medio Raro. So I hope that it does continue growing as the space for this type of como alternative type of conversation, perhaps como helping produce shows and como events that are aligned with these types of discussions. So definitely esa es como la línea que estoy buscando tener con Medio Raro. En verdad, Muchas gracias por el tiempo dado. Creo que la conversación fue muy efectiva, muy afectiva. And really como, I'm very excited to see como este episodio edited. Once again, I want to thank Jara for coming on to the program and having this conversation with me. As audiences become more aware of the active participation that they have in the media, ya sea a través de las redes sociales, ya sea produciendo su propio medio, mucho ojo con eso. I think it's important that we become more conscious about how we consume and how we internalize and how we interpret the things we see. Not to segregate or, believe that things should exclude other people, but more so to really understand the messaging behind the medium and how different types of medias, ya sea música, series de televisión, película, libro, the ways we transmit information, really. It's important and good that we use these tools to learn more about the world and open ourselves to new possibilities and new perspectives, always seeking to further develop humanity. Because a lot of technological conversation these days isn't about humanity. Anyway, bienvenidos a la segunda temporada de Medio Raro. Para acompañar este episodio, Yara y yo trabajamos en un playlist que contiene canciones de Bad Bunny mencionadas aquí, más otras canciones que discutimos, más aluden al tema conversado durante este episodio. Pueden encontrar el enlace en las redes sociales del programa. There's a lot coming up in these following months, so stay tuned and thank you for listening.